We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gouchot.
Jeremy, how are you? How was your Thanksgiving? We hope everybody had a great holiday. And as we prepare, I guess, we've got 3 weeks until the next big holiday, at least here in the U.S., comes along. So I hope everybody had a happy Thanksgiving and everybody has a happy holiday in general. Whichever holiday you celebrate, I hope it's a good one for all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. I had a very good Thanksgiving with family, and I hope you did too.
Yeah, it's a good chance to reflect, as I said on our last show. It's a good chance to reflect on something I don't think probably any of us do nearly enough, and that is to actually, because we can be very gloom and doom sometimes and in talking about current events and world politics, but it is always good to reflect on the things that we actually do have to be thankful for. So it's definitely very beneficial in that regard, and also a lot of good food. So I can't really complain. I had a pretty good week, but I guess it's time to get back to work. And for this program today, we'd like to I think we're going to make a goal to finish chapter 10 of Seth Abramson's book, Proof of Conspiracy. And this is a good tie-in with the end of our last show where we discussed Len Blavatnik, the dual, maybe tri-citizen of 3 or 4 different countries. What is it? Britain, Israel, Russia. Len Blavatnik, one of these international, I guess you call him a jack of all trades of some type. But in particular, we discussed his influence in terms of increasing efforts to step into the American political system via political donations. We actually made a comparison between, as far as the Republican Party goes, with Sheldon Adelson, the domestic kingmaker as far as pro-Israel politics go in the Republican Party. Then you've got Robert Mercer with the combination of supporting people like John Bolton, who push a very obviously hawkish foreign policy, combined with the Breitbart, Cambridge Analytica media empire. And then the third person is the aforementioned Len Blavatnik, who I think is not nearly as well known as obviously either Adelson or Mercer, and I think that's to our own peril, and I think this needs to change. And we particularly talked with Blavatnik about his penchant for increasing his political foray into the American political system via political contributions to both parties. But we noticed a very interesting pattern with his political contributions. With Republicans, it seems to be to more establishment, quote-unquote, friendly Republicans who may not be so inclined to protect a president who is seen as being so pro-Russia. But then with the Democrats, you have this dynamic of where I could see Blavatnik money being used to support Democrats who maybe limit some uncomfortable areas that some Democrat members of Congress might be willing to go in an investigation of Trump and the bigger global geopolitical picture surrounding all of this collusion and 2016 intrigue and ongoing intrigue with the Ukraine. I mean, it's just a theory on my part, but that's kind of what I've deducted from this as being a logical conclusion to the increased political involvement and financial involvement of Len Blavatnik into American politics. And I'll let you comment on that if you want to follow up on that before we get into the chapter, which we're going to be talking much more about Blavatnik as we finish this chapter.
I would say that as the impeachment process continues and more focus is on this Ukraine connection, and more focus on the actual mechanics in many ways of the machinations in the United States around elections. We mentioned last time about the real question about election fraud and how that's nowhere to be seen in the discussion, even amongst the question of people who are questioning the legitimacy based mainly on the question of information warfare, foreign involvement in either support of candidates or this aforementioned information warfare, but that it's has to be grounded in what really is ultimately a military operation at home. And we connected last time, once again, this question of Manafort and who he was working with that very much directly and materially ties operations that Manafort was involved in elections in Ukraine to elections, apparently, that Manafort was involved in here in the United States in 2016. And I would just point people once again to the author of this book that we're about to read from again, Proof of Conspiracy, How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy, Seth Abramson, who on his Twitter thread, in the midst of the increasing process of the impeachment hearings that the Democrats are directing, Abramson himself is saying that the Democrats, for some reason, are limiting the actual scope of understanding about what was actually going down in Ukraine in an attempt to focus it on mainly about trying to get dirt on Biden. And Abramson points out very directly that what was the Trump-Giuliani especially conjunction around machinations in Ukraine started up actually in relationship to the Mueller investigation and questions about whether Trump, Russia, collusion was actually going to get caught by Mueller, and rather than the question of Trump's potential main Democratic opponent in the 2020 election.
Yes, and before we, I want to make one point follow up on that. I think if someone like Seth Abramson, and one of the things he's been criticized for, I think within some circles, and I think this is legitimate criticism, is that Abramson seems to have still a deep trust as far as like maybe the Democratic establishment, particularly when it comes to certain media figures like Rachel Maddow. And I think if Abramson and also some of these other people like say Jay McKenzie and people like him who have been investigating this from a very serious left perspective as far as the international scope and the nature and the depths of all of this, all of these Trump relationships, so to speak, can come to this next conclusion as seeing that the Democrat establishment, either through the media, through Congress, through a combination of both, are really not at the deepest levels, in my opinion, all that serious about really exposing what's really going on with Trump and a much bigger operation, I think, that exposes so much from both political parties and the U.S. Political establishment in general. I think that's a big next step to take for a lot of these people, and I hope they continue down this path.
Yes, and as I mentioned, I had called Fault Lines Radio a couple weeks ago, and I had brought up not only Craig Unger's book, House of Trump, House of Putin, but also this Abramson book, Proof of Conspiracy, and it was dismissed out of hand as I had thought it might be. And Garland Nixon, the co-host of Lee Stranahan, had said, why would I prickle at that? It's been completely debunked, and there was not one fact that was brought up that was debunked in it. So I would just direct people to actually read some texts and deal with facts first.
Exactly. When your sources are, maybe for someone like Garland Nixon, I would guess maybe Aaron Matei and Jimmy Dore, and then you've got Lee Stranahan listening to and palling around with Jim Hoft of the Gateway/Jerusalem Pundit, I guess it's natural that someone like Garland Nixon would come to that conclusion.
All right. So to page 512 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, we just finished talking a bit about the infamous Trump Tower, the Trump-Russia Tower meeting with Veselnitskaya, the lawyer, and then also this guy Akhmetshin, who is a recognized former Soviet military officer. And so on the bottom of page 512, quote, Trump Jr.'s contention, I'll start right before this, quote, Donald Trump Jr. will testify to Congress that he has no memory of the one-time Soviet military officer being in Trump Tower at all. Trump Jr.'s contention is an odd one, and not merely because he testifies to Congress that it was Veselnitskaya, not Akhmetshin, who did nearly all the talking during the meeting at Trump Tower. Given Manafort's presence at the meeting and his subsequent course of negotiations with Konstantin Kilimnik over a sanctions deal authored by a member of the Ukrainian parliament, a course of negotiations that begins within 60 days of the June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, it is telling that Akhmetshin will later tell the Senate Judiciary Committee that he himself met with Kilimnik and a member of the Ukrainian parliament in Washington, quote, probably in 2014, unquote. If 2014 is the correct year, it is a point in time soon after Trump decided to run for president. If the year was in fact 2015, it would be after sanctions had been leveled against Russia for its illegal annexation of Crimea. Notably, both Akhmetshin and Kilimnik have been identified as connected to Russian intelligence, indeed the very same unit as the one responsible for election hacking in 2016, the GRU. Though Akhmetshin denies in his congressional testimony having any association with the GRU, The Guardian will quote an attorney who has often worked with the Russian-born lobbyist as saying, quote, he is a former GRU person for sure, but he once said there is no such thing as, quote-unquote, former, unquote. The possibility that there was indeed follow-up to the sanctions discussion at Trump Tower in June 2016, and that the follow-up was an ongoing sanctions negotiation conducted by a man, Paul Manafort, who had been president at that June meeting, would fly in the face of repeated claims by Trump Jr. and others in Trump's inner circle that there was, in fact, no such follow-up. As for the other Russian entity involved in the 2016 election interference, the, quote, troll factory, unquote, known as the Internet Research Agency, in January 2019, Robert Mueller will reveal that documents his office provided to the defendant's attorneys in the federal prosecution of the IRA as part of the quote-unquote discovery stage of the case were later doctored and disseminated online with the apparent intent to misrepresent the U.S. government's case against more than a dozen Kremlin agents. The Treasury Department's unwillingness to provide possible evidence of Trump-Russia financial crimes to Congress will come under greater scrutiny when it is revealed that Trump's Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, a member of Trump's 16-person presidential transition executive committee, struck a $25 million deal in 2017 with Leonard Blavatnik, an quote-unquote associate of Oleg Deripaska, the Kremlin-allied Russian oligarch at the heart of the Trump-Russia investigation. Quote, questions regarding Trump's relationship with Russia include, unquote, Vanity Fair will write, quote, why did the president leak confidential information about classified intelligence to Russian envoys? Why did he undermine his own UN ambassador by telling the Kremlin not to worry about the punishment she promised would be meted out for its actions in Syria? What was up with the president begging for Russia to be allowed back into the G7 after it was kicked out for invading another European country? And why did Trump literally side with Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence agencies? Now, lawmakers would also like to know why Trump's Treasury Secretary decided to lift sanctions on companies with links to Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, unquote. The magazine notes that Mnuchin's own response to this last, in a litany of critical queries, was that lawmakers should simply, quote-unquote, trust the president on Russia. Mnuchin's dealings with Blavatnik, the Deripaska ally, will come under even further scrutiny from Congress when the Trump administration begins lifting U.S. sanctions, quote, on companies controlled by Deripaska, unquote. Deripaska, a man intimately connected to Vladimir Putin and Paul Manafort, and also a past employer of Joel Zamel, the Israeli business intelligence expert who visited Trump Tower in August 2016 to offer Trump collusive assistance via a massive online disinformation campaign, formerly employed David Giovannis as well. Giovannis is the man 3 congressional witnesses have said may know about Russian compromat on Trump, see Chapter 10. As an expose of Mnuchin's conflicts of interest in the Trump-Russia investigation in Vanity Fair details, the Treasury Secretary's business partner, quote, Blavatnik co-owns Sual Partners with another sanctioned oligarch, Viktor Vekselberg, and Sual, quote, is a major shareholder, unquote, of Rusal, one of Deripaska's sanctioned companies. Blavatnik formerly served on Rusal's board, and one of his companies donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund, unquote. According to Rep. Jackie Spear, Democrat from California, Blavatnik, quote, had a clear financial interest in the outcome of the Treasury action, unquote, against Deripaska that Mnuchin directly oversaw. After Mnuchin's Treasury Department lifts sanctions on Deripaska's companies, the largest one, EN+, names Chris Burnham, a former John Bolton assistant and a Trump transition team member alongside Mnuchin, to be on its board of directors. Though the removal of sanctions on three of Deripaska's largest companies had originally been conditioned on its stepping away from them, it will later be revealed, after the sanctions on the company are lifted, that Deripaska has been allowed to retain a majority stake in EN+. In a major investigative report, the New York Times will reveal that Deripaska has clearly, quote-unquote, benefited from the sanctions deal, which has actually governed the newspaper finds by a, quote, less punitive, unquote, but, quote, binding confidential document that the administration negotiated, unquote, and that the American public was not intended to see. Per the Times, the secret document, quote, shows that the sanctions relief deal will allow Mr. Deripaska to wipe out potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in debt and leave allies of Mr. Deripaska and the Kremlin with significant stakes in his companies, unquote. Moreover, after Mnuchin declares publicly that Deripaska's children, quote, in no way benefited, unquote, from the Trump administration's sanctions relief, it will be revealed in April 2019 that, in fact, Mnuchin and the Treasury Department allowed 10.5 million shares of Deripaska's company, EN+, worth $78 million, to be transferred to a trust fund for his two teenagers. Further controversy is stirred when Deripaska's aluminum company, Rusal, announces shortly after receiving sanctions relief that it will be building what media reports call, quote, the largest new aluminum plant built in the U.S. in nearly 4 decades, unquote, and will be building the plant in Kentucky, the home state of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. As Newsweek will report, quote, McConnell was among the advocates for lifting sanctions on Rusal, unquote. As outrage,
yes, and
go for
I'll
it.
just a real quick aside here. When people see, for example, maybe something on Twitter, hashtag dump Moscow Mitch, or even the Moscow Mitch T-shirt we saw in Iowa a few months back with I think McConnell's picture with the hammer and sickle over it. This is why that's there, and this is where someone like Len Blavatnik and also Oleg Deripaska, these roles of these outsiders, to the American political system become important, because this explains, I think, in large part why a very establishment-friendly politician like McConnell, who might not be so inclined to naturally support maybe Russian geopolitical endeavors or also efforts to make money off of, here in the U.S. for various schemes and business endeavors, this I think is important. And so in the context of that, this is where a lot of the conversation about things like Mitch McConnell possibly being some type of agent or asset, witting or unwitting of the Russians, comes into play via these relationships. Great point. And just a quick follow-up on that is that as more and more people are questioning why someone like Lindsey Graham, what kind of compromat potentially is on Lindsey Graham, I would just point out that while it's obvious, as we pointed out last time, that a key element of political control is blackmail, hidden leverage, sexual compromise about illegal actions in private, there's also this question, as we titled it, the grift for the mill, and that the most obvious compromise is the public corruption involved with things like the buying off of politicians through either big investments in their state's economy, i.e. this question of aluminum plants, Deripaska aluminum investments in Kentucky. Of course, there's Rand Paul there too, but also the question of donations, direct donations to campaigns, to inaugurations, as we're seeing from everyone, obviously, from this question of the Russian oligarchs to even people like Gordon Sondland.
Trump's EU ambassador, who's in the midst of all of this. And then finally, I would just direct people, as this references this question of Russian oligarchs in relationship to aluminum, to investigate the background of the aluminum wars, especially in relationship to the question of the Red Mafia, the Russian-Israeli mob, and then also figures like Michael Chernoy, the Chernoy brothers, and looking at the Intelligence Summit, which was a collaboration or a conjunction of different critical figures in the Western to Israeli intelligence sphere, including people like former CIA Director James Woolsey, that was funded by, I believe, by a Chernoy brother originally. So I think that is in the mix here.
Yes, and real quick, I think that this is where this kind of relationships, I think, explain a lot between the mutual types of areas where both Russia and Israel, who we've been led to believe are enemies or whatnot, really do have a mutual kind of coming together, and where politicians like Graham and McConnell, who are seen as like obvious agents of, say, the Israel lobby or AIPAC or whatever, which I think is very fair to say, where they come into this fold. And so I think this is very important to understand this history.
Back to the text. Bottom half of the page, 515 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, As outrage over Mnuchin's actions grow, Democrats already upset about other information relevant to the Russia investigation that has been withheld by the Trump administration demand that the administration produce, quote, all documents and communications, regardless of form and classification, that refer or relate to any communications between President Trump and President Putin, including in-person meetings and telephone calls, unquote, and including notes taken by U.S. translators in meetings Trump kept secret from the media and, in some cases, his own aides. The 5-page request from the House Intelligence Committee identifies dozens of categories of Trump-Putin communications that have to date remained secret from both Congress and American voters. Committee Chairman Adam Schiff tells CBS News that the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence is looking, quote-unquote, deep into the quote-unquote disturbing Trump Tower Moscow deal in 2015, a deal Schiff says, quote, stood to make him, Trump, more money than he had ever made on any other deal in his life, unquote, and involved then-candidate Trump, quote, pursuing help from the Kremlin in the most compromising circumstance I can imagine, unquote, as well as allegations that, quote, Russians have been laundering money through the Trump organization, unquote. As Schiff is demanding significant additional document production from the White House, the House Judiciary Committee is engaged in a similar exercise with respect to documents from more than 80 individuals and entities whom Republicans had not interviewed or requested materials from when they held Congress. The list of those to whom demands are made under threat of subpoena for any non-production includes executives from Cambridge Analytica, WikiLeaks, the Trump Organization, and AMI, aides and advisors from the 2016 Trump campaign, corporate officers from entities that gave suspicious donations to Trump's inaugural committee, White House employees, members of Trump's family, including Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., Trump's attorneys, personal assistants, friends, and spokesmen, and George Nader. Meanwhile,
interesting group of names that was mentioned there, by the way. Throwing in with obvious Cambridge Analytica, you have WikiLeaks, and then you also have AMI, which brings in the National Enquirer, which has been key in what's going on in Saudi Arabia. So,
good point. Back to the text, page 516 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, meanwhile, in the House Financial Services Committee, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, Democrat, California, announces in early March that the one bank that was still willing to lend to the Trump organization following Trump's string of bankruptcies in the 1990s, Deutsche Bank, has agreed to cooperate with voluminous document requests from the Congress that it had previously resisted. Unquote. An aside here, I just want to point out that very recently, actually, I believe that a judge has held that Deutsche Bank is going to be required to provide some of their documentation from the relationship with Trump. And right, who also is involved in that Deutsche Bank relationship with Trump, but the son of former Supreme Court Justice Kennedy.
Anthony Kennedy, yes. And Anthony Kennedy being the key person involved in both the Citizens United as well as the McCutcheon versus FEC Supreme Court rulings, which were very instrumental as far as just an unlimited amount of money coming into American politics, which I think people like Deripaska and Blavatnik and people like them are taking advantage of.
And people really should go check out the shows that we did surrounding the Kavanaugh hearings, because we really pointed out not only this connection that I referred to the Louders in relationship to Kavanaugh's father, but we also really drilled down a bit on this question of the background of Justice Kennedy's father and the question of potential mob relations in the state of California that hooked directly back into the Nixon administration, which once we over and over we see not only the same kind of format, including the question of impeachment and all that, but some of the same characters, including most obviously people like Roger Stone. But people can go look at that, look at the figure of Murray Chotiner and the question of the relationship of former Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's father to organized crime in a Californian context, I believe. So back into this, and one last question about Deutsche Bank before we head back to the text is, of course, remember the 9/11 connection to Deutsche Bank and questions of put options, and who was the figure who was most obviously tied into that? One of the highest level, I believe a deputy director or maybe the director of clandestine operations. I can't quite remember, but Buzzy Krongard. Okay, go just Google around on Buzzy Krongard and 9/11 and this whole area that we're looking into, and I believe you will find some very interesting connections. All right. Back to the text, page 516 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Concurrently, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee announces that he will move toward demanding that the IRS divulge Trump's tax returns, which in 2016 then-candidate Trump had refused to release on the grounds, since revealed as untrue by his own attorney, Michael Cohen, that he was under audit. And Elijah Cummings, Democrat from Maryland, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, launches an inquiry into Trump's overruling of government intelligence professionals in granting top-secret security clearance to his daughter and son-in-law after they had each been denied such clearance. In addition to looking at the clearances given to Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, Cummings announces his intention to find out why Michael Flynn kept his security clearance after he lied to the FBI about his contacts with a hostile foreign nation, and how Trump advisor Rob Porter maintained his security clearance despite the Trump administration's awareness of, quote, allegations that he had abused two ex-wives, unquote. According to Cummings, Congress will, quote, evaluate the extent to which the nation's most highly guarded secrets were provided to officials who should not have had access to them, unquote. Outside the purview of the inquiry for now is Kushner's reported provision of President's Daily Brief materials to MBS in October 2017, see Chapter 8, and Trump's provision of classified Israeli intelligence to top Kremlin representatives in the Oval Office at a meeting Trump allowed only Kremlin-controlled media to photograph in May 2017.
Yes, and I believe this information of that Trump was giving sensitive Israeli information to the Russians. I believe it had something to do with ISIS even. This was used by the usual suspects within like the pro-Trump, pro-Russian, anti-Zionist alternative media as proof that Russia and Israel don't like each other, because look at how the Zionist media is attacking Trump over this, when I think that's not looking to be the case, but anyway.
Yeah, and I think people should take another look back at that episode, because I believe it was around the same time or in the wake of the revealing that Israeli intelligence had been in the I don't think it was WhatsApp, but it was I forget the Russian-born communications company in relationship to ISIS. And so I question what all of that was actually about, and also I question this, how that might have been related to this long-term relationship, penetration in relationship to between Russian intelligence and Israeli intelligence. So and also it could have been very much theater to some extent too.
And one more very interesting note on this before we move on here is that this leaking of this information and the revelations of Trump giving Israeli, information to Russia coincided with the very interesting Oval Office meeting with Trump and the Russian ambassador, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, where reporters were invited into the room, and when they were invited into the room, Henry Kissinger sitting in a chair, and so when you consider Kissinger's connections to the Center for the National Interest and the strange relationship, the very friendly relationship between Kissinger and Putin, and all of the long-term questions about where Henry Kissinger's allegiances ultimately may and may not lie, that becomes much more interesting as well, in coinciding with that leaking that came out in the media brief furor over it. So
good. Okay, thank you. All right, and so then just one last point I just wanted to, as we read by Flynn, I think it's recently been reported that Flynn has been allowed by a judge to actually go visit what he says is family in Korea. And Seth Abramson himself on his Twitter thread said that basically there's almost no one else who could be facing the conviction or sentencing of the scale of a federal charge involving national security, that the judge involved in it had said that it was in the realm of treason, like someone like Michael Flynn, and then be allowed to go outside the country to visit family in Korea. So I think that's interesting here. All right, so back to the text. Now we're on page 517 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, summarizing the new Democratic push for answers on Trump-Russia collusion, Axios observes, quote, Mueller is just the beginning. House Democrats plan a vast probe of President Trump and Russia with a heavy focus on money laundering, that will include multiple congressional committees and dramatic public hearings and could last into 2020, unquote. What remains in doubt is whether and when Trump will begin to lose Republican allies. By March 2019, Senator John Kennedy, Republican of Louisiana, is calling MBS, quote, the original El Chapo, unquote, and Rubio is accusing the Saudi prince of going, quote, full gangster, unquote, adding to this slight a demand that the Government Accountability Office look into any actions taken by the Department of Energy without interagency communication to initiate the sale of nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia.
Interesting now that Senator Kennedy is now becoming one of the foremost defenders of Trump within the Senate, so take that for what it's worth.
Exactly. Quote, back to the text. Even so, it remains unclear how many senators, even among the many said to be enraged at MBS over the Khashoggi killing, will follow Rubio's suit in pressing for answers regarding Saudi Arabia, let alone Russia. Meanwhile, Trump's legal team appears to back away from earlier claims that no one on Trump's campaign ever colluded with any Russian nationals, which position was itself a retreat from a claim made in 2016 by then-Trump campaign communications director Hope Hicks that, quote, there was no communication between the campaign and any foreign entity during the campaign, unquote. Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani tells CNN in an interview that, quote, I never said there was no collusion between the campaign and Russia or between people in the campaign and Russia, unquote. In all, the Washington Post has identified 10 distinct tactical retreats in the Trump team's defenses to accusations of collusion with the Kremlin. As the new Democratic Congress begins to send out document demands en masse, Trump yet again gives cover to Saudi and Emirati atrocities in Yemen by canceling an Obama-era rule requiring intelligence officials to publish an annual report on American airstrikes in certain countries in and around the Middle East, including Yemen. Even before canceling the legal requirement, the Trump administration had already chosen to ignore it, releasing no report on airstrikes in Yemen in 2018, or for that matter in other countries including Libya, Somalia, and Pakistan. Explaining Trump's decision, the State Department will tell media that the mandatory intelligence reports, which cover CIA-orchestrated strikes, were quote-unquote redundant because other U.S. entities besides the CIA publish records of their own airstrikes, and those records, if not the ones required by rule and involving the CIA, are available. In a Politico interview, Rachel Stoll, a defense expert at the Stimson Center, asks, quote, "Why cancel the rule now? Could this represent a new line of effort or expansion of strikes that we now aren't going to know about?" Unquote. On March 14th, the House votes 420-0 to make the Mueller report public when it is released to the DOJ. Trump's golfing partner and political ally Lindsey Graham blocks the measure in the Senate, however. On February 28th, Israel's Attorney General announces that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be indicted on bribery and breach of trust charges, quote, arising from 3 separate corruption investigations, unquote, making Netanyahu the first sitting Israeli prime minister to ever face indictment on such allegations. Just days later, a quote-unquote leak from Israel's Shin Bet intelligence service, a government entity under Netanyahu's leadership, reveals that quote-unquote Iranians have infiltrated the cell phone of Netanyahu's opponent in the upcoming Israeli presidential elections, Benny Gantz. While noting that, quote, Israel's Iran hacking scandal could ensure Netanyahu's election, unquote, as it suggests Gantz is weak on national security, Haaretz, a major Israeli media outlet, adds cryptically that, quote, it is also possible that other players with an interest in Gantz could have hacked him, masquerading behind a, quote, Iranian signature, unquote, unquote. Given that MBS has recently purchased state-of-the-art Pegasus 3 phone hacking software from Israeli spyware firm NSO, a firm founded and run by former Israeli intelligence agents, and that NBZ has recently been caught using NSO software to target the phone of a prominent human rights activist, the fears expressed in Haaretz of a non-Iranian intervention in the Israeli election are worth consideration. Nor is NSO disconnected from Netanyahu's biggest booster in the United States, President Trump. In 2016, while he was advising Trump, Michael Flynn was also a paid advisor for both NSO Group's parent company, Francisco Partners, and an NSO offshoot, OSY Technologies. Trump's willingness to publicly insert himself into the Israeli elections is evidenced when, just days before the April 9 vote, he invites Netanyahu to the White House to announce that the United States now recognizes Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, a major public relations boost for the Likud politician at perhaps the most fraught moment of his political career, as he is trailing Gantz in the polls with only days left before the election. The Associated Press calls this and other Trump-Netanyahu overtures part of, quote, an unspoken Trump administration endorsement of Netanyahu, and in Israel, having close ties with whoever occupies the White House is seen as a major asset, unquote. By comparison to Trump and his allies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are seeking an alliance with Netanyahu, the Iranians are far more likely to support Gantz than Netanyahu, given the latter's recent declaration that he favors war with Tehran. The Iranians are therefore far less likely to threaten the election chances of the Blue and White Party's candidate, Gantz, by publicly exposing him to blackmail. Days before the election, the Associated Press reports that a mysterious, quote, network of social media bots, unquote, including, quote, hundreds of fake accounts, unquote, are, quote, frequently and exclusively, unquote, supporting Netanyahu and attacking Gantz, even in an echo of the 2016 general election in the United States, quote, inciting hate speech, unquote. The country from which these bots and fake accounts originate is unknown. On April 9, Netanyahu defeats Gantz in the race for Israel's presidency. A development the Associated Press reports means that Netanyahu will, quote, press ahead with a hard-line agenda that will likely eliminate the last hopes of a two-state solution with the Palestinians, unquote. Netanyahu's re-election also ensures that all 6 of the world leaders who endorse, quote, a grand bargain, unquote, in the Middle East, MBS, MBZ, El-Sisi, Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu remain in power in their respective countries. In 2019...
Very interesting right there. It's very interesting that all of those particular people all benefit from this. It's in a very... It seems that no matter how much you hear about the targeting of these particular politicians by various people or various whatever deep state conspiracy you want to believe in, and however these people may be at each other, may or may not be at each other's throats, as all the noise says. Very interesting that they all appear to benefit very much from these policies, and in a way that has I would say has a continuity. So,
yes, thank you. So back to the text, page 500, top of page 520 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, in 2019, the world will see new revelations regarding the scope of Putin's international election meddling. In Italy, L'Espresso reports, as summarized by Mother Jones, that, quote, Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini of the hard-right Lega Nord party sought in 2018 a €3 million funding commitment from Kremlin-linked entities to finance his political campaign, with the money to flow to Lega Nord covertly, tucked behind an ordinary-seeming oil export deal between Italian and Russian companies, unquote. In England, Channel 4 News reveals that, quote, in the heated months in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, unquote, a referendum whose passage Putin strongly favored, quote, millionaire Brexit backer Aaron Banks eagerly pursued a multi-billion-pound gold deal brought to him by a Russian oligarch with links to the Kremlin, unquote. By June, the European Union, along with the Parliament of the United Kingdom, the governing body most immediately and profoundly affected by quote-unquote Brexit, will announce that, quote, Russia conducted a, quote, continued and sustained, unquote, disinformation campaign against Europe's recent parliamentary elections, unquote. And in the United States, the Washington Post cites a recent report by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs establishing that, quote, Russia is responsible for 80% of disinformation activities in Europe, unquote. Meanwhile, CNBC reveals that Putin's top lieutenant, Dmitry Peskov, has managed to place his daughter as an intern at the European Union, a particularly troubling development given the Kremlin's commitment to breaking up the EU and its past interference with the Union's elections. Indeed, as far back as 2016, the BBC had aired a report accusing Putin of, quote, using hybrid warfare, unquote, that is, the BBC explains, quote, any form of international aggression short of open invasion, unquote, to, quote, destabilize the EU, unquote.
I think this is important here because when you think about this, and one of the major goals, it seems, of this proof of conspiracy, this foreign collusion, that in a way is well known, but also in a way kind of goes under the radar, is the common goal of a lot of these very foreign players, for whatever reason, to weaken and undermine Europe as a quote-unquote democratic, power. And we can, of course, take that apart all day long, whether or not it's actually true or not the EU represents that. I would go in the direction of it doesn't. But there is a common desire to really weaken Europe as far as a unified entity in the current context. And this is all important in that you mentioned Brexit there. And Brexit, I think, is where, as we've talked about before, is where the Israeli and Russian interest, I think, through Breitbart, through Cambridge Analytica, come together in terms of really popularizing this movement to remove Britain from the EU. And then you've got Matteo Salvini of Italy, who is seen as very much an ally of this Judeo-Christian European Western populist movement. But also at the same time, Salvini is basically okaying the Belt Road Initiative as far as deals between Italy and China. And so I think all of this plays into this factor of, and it brings China into the equation, which I don't think has been addressed as much by Abramson. There's still a lot of questions there. But I think all of this goes towards this bigger goal of weakening, the European Union and weakening Europe as a collective global power on the global stage.
I would just quickly point out that it's interesting. I just read something about how the Michael Oren commented on Pompeo's recent announcement about how, to me, in my mind, it's basically the U.S. is claiming to decriminalize the Israeli settlement building in relationship to the West Bank. And although that is just one piece of a much bigger architecture of basically the entire history of the Israeli state being one long-term occupation and ethnic cleansing operation that's ongoing, it is interesting that Oren then spoke to that this was actually a domestic political concern that Pompeo was making in relationship to supporting the Trump campaign's desire to woo Christian evangelical Zionists in a handful of key battleground states to show that there was a difference between voting Trump and Republican versus voting Democrat in the 2020 elections. And so I would just, one last thing is I point out that there is this aspect of how it used to be the U.S. consensus that the support for this aspect of Israel had to be, or that support for Israel had to be bipartisan. There could not really be any serious dissent across the parties. But at the same time, as you see rising dissent mainly coming out of in aspects of the progressive grassroots Democratic Party, you also see the shift, it looks like, as we've been pointing out over and over, of Israeli interests and support for their long-term geopolitical concerns, both at home and abroad, towards the East. And it's this very same Republican Party that seems to be most linked up in some of its key and highest elements and in being bought off, blackmailed, or whatever, to this very specific Eastern interest that Israel looks to be shifting away from the West towards.
I couldn't agree more, and we've quoted numerous times on this show Michael Oren's quote to Bloomberg, I believe, about how Israel benefits from a weakened Europe, and that's one of the things. These steps that Trump was taking are steps that no other president's taken, as we've said so many times before, moving the embassy, Golan Heights, and now the unlimited settlement building, basically just given the green light to it, which people predicted was going to happen. It was inevitable. And this is a step too far. This is 3 steps too far for the quote-unquote bipartisan consensus on Israel that I think has dominated American politics over the past several decades, but also the more liberal-minded European politics where, yes, they support the continue to aid to Israel as a thriving power, the boot over the Palestinians in general as far as continuing to see Israel as a power and continuing to support this and finance this, but they're not with these more extreme policies, and I think this is a big part of it, and where I think this comes into play is that you're seeing a dual goal of basically discrediting the U.S. as being the protector of Israel, while at the same time in this move to the East. And I think what a lot of people need to see, and I think things like proof of conspiracy make this clear, is that this shift to the East is not something that more and more is not something that's appearing to be a bad thing for Israel, but is actually going to be very beneficial to its long-term goals that the American bipartisan consensus for so many years has not been willing to support, as well as the European establishment.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and we have 3 pages of the chapter excluding the annotations section. So
all right, let's knock this out.
We'll see if we can knock the rest of at least the chapter out. Okay, bottom of page 520, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, in the spring of 2019, new attention is focused on Trump's connections to China, first detailed as problematic and potentially collusive in the Steele dossier, as a Chinese woman with a suspicious thumb drive looking to meet with Trump gains access to Mar-a-Lago, and numerous individuals close to Trump are found to have been in contact with a second Chinese woman, Cindy Yang, who bragged online about selling access to the president. In the first instance, the woman who breaches security at the president's country club, Yu Jingjiang, is found to have 2 Chinese passports, a self-executing malware application, 9 USB drives, 5 SIM cards, $7,500 in $100 bills, and a, quote, signal detector to detect hidden cameras, unquote. Most troublingly, Zhang represents, quote, an invitation to Mar-a-Lago managers that is the same as an invitation posted on the website of Cindy Yang, the Florida spa founder who is allegedly selling access to Trump events at Mar-a-Lago, unquote, to Chinese nationals. Federal agents tell a court that they, quote, believe Xi Zhang may be a Chinese intelligence agent and quote unquote, extreme flight risk, unquote. Yang, the spa owner, is at the time a potential witness in a, quote, human trafficking investigation, unquote. As the former owner of several spas that were shut down by federal investigators for allegedly selling illicit sexual services, the investigation, notes the Miami Herald, had by the time of Zhang's arrest, quote, shuttered 10 massage parlors and resulted in charges against more than 300 men, unquote, including one well-known businessman who is a close friend of the president, New England Patriots president Robert Kraft. Of Kraft, the Miami Herald writes, quote, only in Florida could a billionaire's massage parlor pit stop unmask a possible spy ring, unquote. In the days following Kraft's arrest, pictures will emerge online of Yang posing with Trump himself, as well as numerous Trump friends, family, and allies, including Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican of Florida, Kellyanne Conway, Melania Trump, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, Florida's Republican Senator Rick Scott, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Sarah Palin, Fox News host Jesse Waters, pro-Trump Twitter personality Dan Bongino, actor Jon Voight, and former Trump administration advisor Sebastian Gorka.
All of these people could be easily described as anti-China Zionist saber rattlers, so I wonder what's going on with this, as we've talked about in the past. So,
bottom of page 521, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, in April, the Palm Beach Post reports that there is, quote, no trace of the money raised, unquote, from Trump's Asian Pacific American presidential inaugural gala. Corporate donors for the event included, per the Post, quote, an embattled Saipan-based casino later raided by the FBI, and a Guam-based shipyard, and a handful of Pacific Island hotel operators, all of which benefited from a foreign labor bill signed into law by Trump, unquote, in early 2018. Just an aside here, I just want to say, forget Ukraine and all the evidence around Trump trying to, trade U.S., security arrangements, no matter whether you agree or disagree with them, for his own personal political profit, and just factor in all of this is, multiple violations of the Emoluments Clause at the very least. Okay, top of page 522 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, congressional Democrats quickly call for criminal and counterintelligence investigations of Yang's online claims that she has successfully sold access to Trump. An April 5th, 2019 Miami Herald story will carry the startling headline, quote, Cindy Yang helped Chinese tech stars get $50,000 photos with Trump. Who paid? Unquote. By law, notes the newspaper, quote, selling tickets to campaign fundraisers without disclosing the buyer to the Federal Election Commission is illegal. Selling tickets to foreign nationals who are banned from donating to American political causes would be an additional violation of U.S. law, unquote. Meanwhile, U.S. media begins covering Eric Prince's new overseas venture, the Hong Kong-based Frontier Services Group, FSG, which in early 2019, just weeks after Prince has stepped down as chairman while retaining a 9% stake and deputy chairman position within the business, holds a, quote, signing ceremony to build a training center in far western China where the Chinese government has detained as many as 1 million Uyghur Muslims in political camps, unquote. Prince had reportedly secured by 2014 support for FSG from China's CITIC investment conglomerate, an entity holding assets of nearly $1 trillion. Tellingly, one of the chief investors in Prince's FSG is, according to Fast Company, quote, Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince Court, unquote, in other words, MBZ. In a March 2019 interview with Al Jazeera, Prince denies participating in the construction in China of what the media outlet calls, quote, basically concentration camps, unquote, falsely saying that FSG has only contracted with the Chinese for, quote-unquote, construction services, when, as Al Jazeera notes, the company's own press release, which names Prince multiple times, advertises the creation of, quote, training facilities, unquote, for the camp's guards. In fact, as BuzzFeed News first reported in 2017, Prince, quote, is setting up a private army for China, unquote, a project similar to the one he had already executed in the United Arab Emirates and has been seeking to undertake in Afghanistan. He has also proposed such as project with an idea for a quote-unquote army of spies controlled by Trump in America itself. When a March 2019 ProPublica report reveals that Elliot Broidy's California offices were raided by federal agents in the summer of 2018 on suspicion of Broidy having committed, quote, conspiracy, money laundering, and violations of the law governing covert lobbying on behalf of foreign officials, unquote, the Trump-China connection once again enters the news, as it is Trump whom Broidy has primarily directed his bribery efforts at, if anyone, and China, along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is noted by ProPublica as one of the foreign nations with whom Broidy is suspected of covertly dealing. One particularly telling email exchange between Nader and Broidy, revealed as a result of the raid, sees the former praising the latter for, quote, how well you handle chairman, unquote, since revealed as a code name for Trump. That the Broidy case is in the Northern District of California underscores that cases involving Trump and collusion, in this case collusive behavior undergirding potential bribery and money laundering charges, persist even after the termination of the special counsel's investigation in D.C. in March. Indeed, the total number of federal and state entities still investigating Trump, his family, his aides, and his business associates after the end of the special counsel's probe is 20. Additional evidence that investigations into possible money laundering by Trump and his business will continue beyond the completion of the special counsel's work appears in early April, when two congressional committees not only subpoena Deutsche Bank for Trump's banking records, but also issue subpoenas to 8 other banks for information related to Russian money laundering. Unquote. And that's the end of the chapter on page 523. We don't have time for the annotations. And Greg, we have about a minute and a half left. I just want to quickly point out, just to disclose, that I have found out that Elliot Broidy is or was on the board of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, where I was bar mitzvahed as a 13-year-old teenager in the early 90s. So I had found that out, and I wanted to just disclose that. So I think that's interesting. And, of course, the country that's not mentioned here in terms of Elliot Broidy's tight ties is, of course, Israel. Last minute, Greg.
Wow, so I'm so glad we got to finish this finally, and I think that this actually is going to make a really great segue. I'm not going to give details of our lead-in to our next show, but I think before the end of the week, we're going to be recording a long-form show that I think people are going to find very, very interesting. I think people will enjoy it, I hope. But anyway, look forward to that. And as for right now, I'm glad we got through this chapter, and I think this chapter opens up so many areas of potential future research while continuing to really bring together talking points that we've been hammering for the last year or so.
Thank you very much, Greg. Until next week, Antidote. We out.